My sister cut up my $4,000 custom wedding dress to make a princess costume for her daughter's birthday party, then claimed it was an accident when confronted. Everyone believed her lies until the dress designer herself showed up at our family dinner and exposed the truth in front of everyone. I am Cassandra, 29, and I need to tell this story because what happened still feels surreal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My younger sister, Natalie, 26, has always been the golden child in our family while I've been cast as the responsible, boring older sister. Our parents, Robert, 58, and Patricia, 55, have spent our entire lives making excuses for Natalie's behavior and somehow finding ways to make me the villain whenever she does something wrong. Growing up in our small town of Willowbrook, this pattern was established early and never changed. When I was 11 and Natalie was 8, she deliberately broke my science fair project the night before the competition. I had spent 3 weeks building a working volcano model for the regional science fair, staying up late every night after homework to perfect the chemical reactions and paint the papier-mâché mountain. The morning of the competition, I found it smashed on the garage floor with obvious footprints in the dried lava. When I showed my parents the destroyed project, Natalie immediately started crying and claimed she had accidentally knocked it over while looking for her bike. Despite the fact that her bike was nowhere near where the project had been carefully stored on a high shelf, and despite the clear evidence of deliberate stomping, my mother comforted Natalie and told me that accidents happen. My father just shrugged and said maybe I should have been more careful about where I put important things. I missed the science fair that day, while Natalie got ice cream for being upset about the accident. When I was 14, Natalie went through my room and found the $200 I had saved from babysitting jobs all summer. I was saving for a guitar that I had been wanting for months, counting every dollar carefully and keeping the money in what I thought was a secure hiding place in my desk drawer. Natalie took the money and spent it on makeup and trendy clothes at the mall with her friends, then claimed she thought it was family money that she was allowed to use. When I discovered the theft and confronted her, she burst into tears and ran to our parents. Instead of making her return the items or face any consequences, my mother sat me down for a lecture about family sharing and generosity. She said that as the older sister, I needed to be more understanding of Natalie's needs and that hoarding money while my little sister had nothing was selfish. My father nodded along and suggested that maybe this was a good lesson about not being so materialistic. They made me split my remaining babysitting earnings with Natalie to keep things fair. The pattern continued throughout high school. When I was 16, Natalie told everyone at school that I had cheated on my SATs after I scored significantly higher than she did on her practice tests. The rumor spread quickly through our small town, and even some teachers began looking at me suspiciously. When I found out Natalie had started the rumor, she claimed she was just wondering out loud how someone could improve their scores so much, and she never meant for people to think I actually cheated. My parents' response was to lecture me about being more humble about my achievements and not making Natalie feel bad about herself. They suggested that maybe I should tutor Natalie instead of showing off my test scores. The rumor followed me for months, and I ended up having to take the SATs again just to prove my scores were legitimate, paying the fee with my own part-time job money. When graduation came around, I had earned a full academic scholarship to State University while Natalie barely managed to graduate with a C average. Instead of celebrating my achievement, the family dinner conversation focused on how we needed to be sensitive to Natalie's feelings and not make her feel like a failure. My mother actually suggested that maybe I should consider staying local for college so I could help support Natalie through this difficult time. Throughout all of this, my father remained largely passive, rarely intervening in conflicts but always supporting whatever decision my mother made regarding Natalie. He seemed to view his role as keeping the peace rather than addressing problems, which meant enabling my mother's favoritism and Natalie's increasingly entitled behavior. I moved away for college at 18 and rarely came home except for major holidays. The distance helped me gain perspective on how dysfunctional our family dynamics really were. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in graphic design, and worked part-time at a local design studio to support myself. After graduation, I found a position at a marketing firm in the city of Riverside, about 3 hours from Willowbrook. 2 years ago, I met Daniel, 31, at a professional networking event. He works in architecture and is everything my family is not: honest, supportive, and genuinely interested in my success. Daniel treats me as an equal partner and has never once made me feel like I need to apologize for my achievements or dim my light to make others comfortable. When he proposed last spring, I felt like I was finally building the life I had always dreamed of. For our October wedding, I decided to splurge on something truly special. I had always been practical with money, buying generic brands and shopping sales, partly because of my upbringing and partly because I wanted to save for important things. The wedding dress felt like the one time I could invest in something beautiful just for me. I found Madame Celeste's boutique in the Arts District of Riverside, a small atelier known for creating custom gowns for discerning brides. Madame Celeste herself, an elegant woman in her 60s who had trained in Paris, worked with me to design a dress that was uniquely mine. The gown featured hand-sewn French lace, delicate pearl beading that caught the light perfectly, and a silhouette that made me feel like the best version of myself. The creation process took 4 months, with multiple fittings and careful adjustments. Madame Celeste treated each appointment like we were creating a work of art together, and in many ways, we were. The final cost was $4,000, more than I had ever spent on a single item, but I had saved carefully and it represented everything I wanted for my wedding day: elegance, craftsmanship, and a celebration of this new chapter in my life. Since my apartment in Riverside was small and lacked proper storage space, I decided to keep the finished dress at my parents' house in Willowbrook until the wedding. Their master bedroom had a large walk-in closet with good air circulation and space for the dress to hang properly without wrinkling. This decision, which seemed practical at the time, would turn out to be the biggest mistake I could have made. Looking back now, I should have recognized the warning signs based on our family history. But I was so focused on my happiness with Daniel and excited about our future together that I forgot the most important lesson from my childhood: never give Natalie access to anything that matters to you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Moving to Riverside had been the best decision of my life. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who valued hard work and creativity rather than drama and manipulation. My colleagues at Sterling and Associates Marketing respected my design skills and innovative ideas. Within 18 months, I had been promoted to senior creative designer and was leading campaigns for major regional clients. The contrast between my professional life and my family dynamics couldn't have been starker. At work, when I presented a successful campaign, my boss Jennifer would publicly acknowledge my contributions and discuss advancement opportunities. When clients specifically requested to work with me again, it was seen as a testament to my abilities. Nobody tried to diminish my achievements or suggest I should hide my success to make others feel better. Living in my own apartment in the Riverside Arts District, I had created a space that truly reflected who I was. The walls displayed my favorite design pieces and photography from local artists. I had a dedicated workspace where I could pursue freelance projects and personal creative endeavors. For the first time in my life, I could leave something valuable sitting out without worrying that someone would destroy it out of jealousy or spite. I had also built genuine friendships with people who shared my interests and values. My friend group consisted of other creatives, photographers, graphic designers, writers, and artists who understood the dedication required to build a career in the creative field. We supported each other's projects, celebrated successes together, and provided honest feedback without hidden agendas. It was refreshing to have relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. When I met Daniel at the annual Riverside Creative Professionals Mixer, I almost didn't believe someone like him could be interested in me. Growing up with Natalie had conditioned me to expect that any attention or good fortune would somehow be taken away or diminished. Daniel's approach was completely different from anyone I had ever met. He was genuinely curious about my work, asking thoughtful questions about my design process and the challenges of working with different clients. When I mentioned a particularly difficult branding project I was working on, he didn't try to offer solutions or change the subject. Instead, he listened carefully and asked follow-up questions that showed he was really paying attention. By the end of our first conversation, I felt like he saw me as a complete person rather than someone whose primary role was to accommodate others. Our relationship developed naturally over several months. Daniel never made me feel like I was competing for his attention or walking on eggshells to maintain his interest. He celebrated my professional victories without trying to make them about himself. When I landed a major account with a luxury resort chain, he took me to dinner specifically to celebrate my achievement. He didn't mention his own work accomplishments or try to redirect the conversation. The entire evening was about recognizing my success. Daniel's family was equally refreshing. His parents, both retired teachers, treated me with warmth and genuine interest from our first meeting. They asked about my career, remembered details from previous conversations, and never once suggested that I should tone down my personality or achievements. His sister Amy, a nurse practitioner, became a close friend who shared my love of hiking and photography. Family gatherings were relaxed affairs where everyone contributed to conversations and no one person dominated the attention. The contrast with my own family became even more apparent when Daniel and I got engaged. His proposal was thoughtful and personal. He had designed a custom ring incorporating elements that reflected both our personalities. When we called his family to share the news, they were genuinely excited and immediately began asking about our timeline and how they could help with planning. When I called my parents to announce our engagement, the response was notably different. My mother's first comment was whether Natalie knew yet, and her second was a concern about how a wedding might affect Natalie's feelings since she was still single. My father's contribution was a warning about the costs of weddings and whether I had thought through the financial implications carefully enough. Nobody asked about Daniel's proposal or expressed happiness about my news. The engagement period revealed even more about how my family viewed my role. Every conversation about wedding plans somehow became about Natalie's needs or feelings. When I mentioned looking at venues, my mother suggested I choose something modest so Natalie wouldn't feel pressured to have an expensive wedding when her turn came. When I talked about the guest list, there were detailed discussions about which of Natalie's friends should be invited to avoid hurt feelings. Most frustrating was my mother's assumption that Natalie would automatically be my maid of honor. When I mentioned that I was considering asking my college roommate Rebecca, who had been my closest friend for over a decade, my mother was genuinely confused. She couldn't understand why I would choose someone outside the family when I had a sister. The fact that Natalie and I barely spoke and had completely different values seemed irrelevant to her. Planning the wedding became an exercise in maintaining boundaries I had never successfully established before. Daniel's support was crucial during this period. He helped me recognize when my family's demands were unreasonable and gave me the confidence to make decisions based on what we wanted rather than what would prevent family drama. The dress shopping experience perfectly illustrated the difference between my old and new life. When I went to boutiques in Riverside with my friends Rebecca and Jessica, they focused on helping me find something that made me feel beautiful and confident. They offered honest opinions about fit and style while respecting my personal preferences. The experience was collaborative and supportive. When my mother and Natalie joined me for a shopping trip to a bridal store in Willowbrook, the dynamic was completely different. Natalie dominated the conversation, offering critiques of every dress I tried on and making comments about what would look better on her body type. My mother spent most of the time managing Natalie's feelings rather than focusing on helping me find the right dress. When I tried on a dress I loved, Natalie's immediate response was that it was trying too hard, and that simpler would be more appropriate for someone my age. After that shopping trip, I decided to handle the dress selection independently. I didn't want my wedding dress choice to be influenced by Natalie's jealousy or my mother's need to prevent conflict. This decision led me to Madame Celeste's boutique, where I could focus purely on creating something beautiful without family drama. The process of designing my dress with Madame Celeste was transformative. She treated the project as a collaboration between artist and client, incorporating my ideas while offering her expertise about construction and design elements. Each fitting was scheduled well in advance, and she never rushed the process or made me feel like I was being demanding for wanting specific details. The dress that emerged from this process was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. The French lace had an intricate pattern that caught light beautifully, and the pearl beading was positioned to enhance the dress's natural lines. When I put on the completed gown for the final fitting, I felt transformed. For the first time in my life, I was wearing something that had been created specifically for me, with attention to every detail that mattered to me. Madame Celeste's pride in her work was evident as she made final adjustments. She explained that each dress she created was unique, designed specifically for the individual bride's body and personality. She never made two identical dresses, viewing each project as a custom work of art. When I expressed concern about storing the dress properly until the wedding, she provided detailed instructions about temperature, humidity, and handling. The decision to store the dress at my parents' house seemed logical at the time. My riverside apartment had limited closet space, and the dress needed to hang properly to maintain its shape. My parents' master bedroom closet was spacious and climate-controlled, seeming like the perfect solution. I carefully transported the dress to Willowbrook, hanging it in a protective garment bag in the center of the closet where it would have plenty of space. Looking back, I realized this decision represented my ongoing hope that my family could be trusted with something important to me. Despite years of evidence to the contrary, part of me still wanted to believe that my parents would protect something that mattered to me and that Natalie would respect boundaries when it came to my wedding preparations. The dress hanging in that closet represented more than just wedding attire. It symbolized my transformation from the overlooked older sister to a successful woman who had built her own life and found genuine love. It represented my ability to invest in something beautiful for myself without guilt or justification. Most importantly, it represented my hope that I could share important moments with my family without the usual drama and manipulation. Within 3 weeks, that hope would be completely shattered in a way I never could have anticipated. 3 weeks before my wedding, Natalie called me on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing final catering details with Daniel. Her voice had that particular breathless quality it got when she was excited about something, and she was talking faster than usual. "Cassie, you won't believe what happened," she said, using the childhood nickname I had asked her to stop using years ago. "Remember how I've been stressing about Lily's princess party? Well, I found the most amazing solution, and she's going to have the most magical birthday ever." Natalie's daughter Lily was turning 6, and according to my mother's weekly updates, this birthday party had become Natalie's entire focus for the past 2 months. Natalie had been unemployed since Lily's father left town 18 months ago, and she was living with our parents while supposedly looking for work. The reality was that she spent most of her time on social media, complaining about her situation and planning elaborate events she couldn't afford. "That's great," I said, putting the phone on speaker so Daniel could hear while I continued reviewing our vendor contracts. "I'm sure Lily will love whatever you plan." "Oh, she will," Natalie continued, and I could hear the smugness creeping into her voice. "I've been looking everywhere for the perfect princess dress for her to wear, but everything in stores is so cheap and tacky. You know how picky Lily is about fabrics and details. She has such refined taste for a little girl." This was classic Natalie behavior, projecting adult sophistication onto her 6-year-old daughter to justify expensive purchases she couldn't afford. Lily was a sweet child, but she was happy playing with cardboard boxes and dress-up clothes from thrift stores. The refined taste existed only in Natalie's imagination and her desire to compete with other mothers on social media. "I'm sure you'll find something perfect," I said absently, scanning through the florist's final delivery schedule. "Maybe check some of the children's boutiques in Riverside. They might have more options than what's available in Willowbrook." "Actually," Natalie said, and something in her tone made me look up from the papers, "I already found the perfect solution. I was at Mom and Dad's house today helping with some cleaning, and I went upstairs to organize the closets. When I saw your wedding dress hanging there, I had the most brilliant idea." My blood went cold. Daniel looked at me with concern as he watched my expression change. I felt like I had suddenly been plunged into ice water, every nerve in my body alert to danger. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully, hoping I had misunderstood what she was implying. "Well, your dress is absolutely gorgeous, and it has all that beautiful lace and beadwork that would be perfect for a princess costume. I was thinking I could just take some of the fabric and trim to make Lily the most amazing dress. There's so much material there, and honestly, you'd never even notice if I borrowed just a little bit." I stood up so quickly that my chair fell backward, the sound echoing through my apartment. Daniel immediately moved to my side, putting a steadying hand on my shoulder as he watched my face. "Natalie, absolutely not," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "That dress cost $4,000, and it's custom-made for my wedding. You cannot take any part of it for anything." "Oh, come on, Cassie," she said, and I could hear her rolling her eyes through the phone. "Don't be so dramatic. I'm not talking about ruining your precious dress. I just need a little bit of the lace and maybe some of those pearl beads. There's enough material there for 10 wedding dresses. You're being selfish over a few inches of fabric. It's not about the amount of fabric, I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. It's my wedding dress. It was made specifically for me, and every detail was planned carefully. You cannot take any part of it. But it's just sitting there doing nothing, Natalie whined, her voice taking on the petulant tone she used when she wasn't getting her way. Your wedding isn't for 3 weeks, and Lily's party is this Saturday. I promise I'll be super careful and only take what I need from places where it won't show. Daniel was making urgent hand gestures, encouraging me to be firm in my refusal. I knew he was right, but part of me was already calculating whether there might be some compromise that could work. This was the old pattern. Natalie would make an unreasonable request, I would refuse, and then I would gradually talk myself into finding a middle ground to avoid conflict. The answer is no, Natalie, I said firmly. Find another solution for Lily's costume. There are plenty of princess dresses available online or in stores that would be perfect for a 6-year-old's party. You're being ridiculous, she snapped, her voice hardening. It's just fabric, and I'm family. After everything Mom and Dad have done for you over the years, this is how you repay them. By refusing to help your own niece have a special birthday. The guilt trip was beginning, right on schedule. Next would come the tears, followed by accusations that I cared more about material things than family relationships. I had seen this performance countless times throughout our childhood, and it usually ended with me giving in to keep the peace. My wedding dress has nothing to do with what Mom and Dad have done for me, I said. And helping Lily have a special birthday doesn't require destroying my wedding dress. Buy her a costume from a store like every other parent does. I can't afford the kind of dress she wants, Natalie said, her voice beginning to crack with what sounded like tears. You know I'm struggling financially right now. I'm just asking for a little help from my sister. Why are you being so cruel? Daniel shook his head vigorously and mouthed, "Don't give in," as he watched me weaken. He had witnessed enough of my family's manipulation tactics to recognize what was happening. I'm not being cruel, I said. I'm protecting something that's important to me. There are other ways to make Lily's party special that don't involve my wedding dress. Fine, Natalie said coldly. I guess I know where I stand with you now. Don't expect me to go out of my way to help you with anything in the future. And don't blame me when Lily's party is ruined because her aunt was too selfish to share. The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, shaking with a combination of anger and anxiety. Daniel wrapped his arms around me, and I leaned into his support. You did the right thing, he said softly. She was completely out of line to even ask. I know, I said, but doubt was already creeping in. But what if she's right? What if I am being selfish? It's just fabric, and Lily is innocent in all this. It's not just fabric, Daniel said firmly. It's your wedding dress that you saved for and had custom made. The fact that she can't see why that's important says everything about her, not about you. I tried to push the conversation out of my mind and focus on finishing our wedding preparations. But over the next few days, I found myself second-guessing my decision. Maybe I could have offered to help pay for a costume instead of refusing outright. Maybe there was some compromise I hadn't considered. By Friday evening, guilt was eating at me. I imagined Lily being disappointed about her costume while her cousins and friends wore elaborate dresses. I pictured Natalie struggling to create something special with limited resources and skills. Most of all, I dreaded the family drama that would inevitably result from this conflict. Saturday morning, the day of Lily's party, I received a text from my mother, "Hope you're happy. Lily's crying because her costume fell apart. Family should come first." The message hit me like a punch to the stomach. I spent the day alternating between guilt about Lily's disappointment and anger about being manipulated. Daniel tried to reassure me, but I could tell he was frustrated with my family's behavior and my tendency to absorb their guilt trips. Sunday evening, I decided I needed to check on my dress and make sure it was still safely hanging in my parents' closet. Something about Natalie's determined tone during our phone conversation had been nagging at me all weekend. I drove to Willowbrook after work, planning to have a quick dinner with my parents and verify that my dress was undisturbed. When I arrived at the house, my parents were in the living room watching television. My mother greeted me with her usual lukewarm welcome, and my father barely looked up from his newspaper. The atmosphere felt tense, as if they had been discussing something unpleasant before I arrived. "Where's Natalie?" I asked, noticing her car wasn't in the driveway. "She and Lily went to get ice cream," my mother said shortly. "The party was challenging yesterday." I decided not to ask for details about the party and instead headed upstairs to check on my dress. The master bedroom was dark, and I flipped on the light as I approached the walk-in closet. Everything looked normal from the doorway. My dress was still hanging in its garment bag in the center of the closet space. But as I got closer, something looked wrong. The garment bag seemed deflated, as if it wasn't properly supporting the dress's structure. My heart began racing as I carefully unzipped the protective cover. What I found inside made me stop breathing for several seconds. My wedding dress was hanging there, but it was no longer the dress I had left. The bottom third of the skirt had been cut away completely, leaving jagged edges where the French lace had been severed. The intricate beadwork around the bodice was gone, with obvious gaps where pearls and crystals had been removed. One entire sleeve had been cut off at the shoulder, and the other had been shortened to 3/4 length. The dress that had taken 4 months to create, that had been designed specifically for my body and my wedding day, had been butchered into an unrecognizable remnant. What remained was barely enough fabric to qualify as a dress at all, let alone the elegant gown I had planned to wear in 3 weeks. I stood there staring at the destruction, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't borrowing a little fabric or trim. This was deliberate, systematic destruction that had clearly taken hours to accomplish. Someone had carefully cut away every beautiful detail that made the dress special, leaving behind only the basic structure. My hands shook as I took photos with my phone, documenting the damage from every angle. The evidence was clear: this had been done with scissors or fabric shears, and whoever did it had taken their time to remove specific elements rather than making quick, panicked cuts. As the initial shock wore off, rage began building in my chest. This wasn't an accident or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated destruction designed to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Natalie had gotten exactly what she wanted despite my refusal, and she had made sure I couldn't use my dress for its intended purpose. I carefully zipped the garment bag closed and walked downstairs on unsteady legs. My parents were still in the living room, but something about my expression must have alerted them that something was wrong. "What happened to my wedding dress?" I asked quietly, holding up my phone to show them the photos I had taken. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about what kind of battle I was about to face. My mother's face went pale when she saw the photos on my phone, but her expression quickly shifted from shock to something that looked almost like resignation. My father glanced at the images briefly before looking away, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he already knew what had happened. "Oh honey," my mother said softly, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when she was about to deliver unwelcome news. "I was wondering when you'd discover that. Natalie told us there was a little accident with your dress." "A little accident?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Mom, look at these pictures. This isn't an accident. Someone systematically cut apart my entire wedding dress." My father shifted uncomfortably in his recliner but didn't look up from his newspaper. This was his standard response to family conflict: physical presence without emotional engagement. He had perfected the art of being in the room without actually participating in difficult conversations. "Well, Natalie explained what happened," my mother continued, settling back into her chair as if we were discussing minor household damage. "She said she was just trying to borrow a small piece of lace for Lily's costume, but the fabric started unraveling when she cut it. You know how delicate those fancy materials can be. Once it started falling apart, there wasn't much she could do to stop it." I stared at my mother in disbelief. The photos clearly showed clean, deliberate cuts and systematic removal of beadwork. There was no evidence of unraveling or accidental damage. Someone had spent considerable time carefully dismantling my dress piece by piece. "That's not what happened," I said, showing her the photos again. "Look at these cuts. They're clean and precise. Someone used fabric shears to remove specific sections. The beadwork was pulled off individual pearls at a time. This took hours of deliberate work. Cassandra, you're getting yourself worked up over something that can't be changed, my mother said with a sigh. Natalie feels terrible about what happened. She's been crying all weekend about ruining your dress. The last thing she needs is you attacking her when she's already devastated. The familiar pattern was beginning. Natalie's feelings were the priority, while the actual damage she had caused was minimized. My mother's response completely ignored the severity of what had been done and immediately shifted focus to protecting Natalie from consequences. Where is Natalie now? I asked. I want to talk to her about this directly. She and Lily went to stay at her friend Carmen's house for a few days. My father finally spoke, still not looking at me. She was too upset to be here when you came over. She knew you'd be angry. The fact that Natalie had preemptively left the house told me everything I needed to know about whether this had been an accident. People don't hide from family members when they've made genuine mistakes. They apologize and try to make things right. So she destroyed my wedding dress and then ran away instead of facing me? I asked. How does that support the story that this was an accident? She's not running away, my mother said defensively. She's giving you time to cool down so you can discuss this rationally when you're not so emotional. Natalie knows how you get when you're upset about material things. The dismissal of my reaction as being emotional about material things was particularly galling. This wasn't about materialism, this was about respect, boundaries, and the deliberate destruction of something irreplaceable that held deep personal meaning. This isn't about material things, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. This is about Natalie deliberately destroying my wedding dress after I specifically told her she couldn't use any part of it. This is about her having no respect for my boundaries or my property. Now you're just being dramatic, my mother said with a wave of her hand. It's a dress, Cassandra. Yes, it was expensive, and yes, it's unfortunate that it got damaged. But you're acting like Natalie committed some kind of crime. She was trying to make her daughter's birthday special with limited resources. Surely you can understand that as a motivation. The reframing was masterful and depressingly familiar. Natalie's destruction of my dress was now characterized as an understandable attempt to be a good mother, while my upset about having my property destroyed was painted as shallow materialism. Understanding her motivation doesn't excuse what she did, I said. And it doesn't change the fact that I specifically told her no, and she did it anyway. She went behind my back and destroyed something that can't be replaced. My father finally looked up from his newspaper, but his expression suggested he wanted this conversation to end rather than reach any kind of resolution. Maybe we should all take a step back and think about what's really important here, he said in the measured tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while avoiding taking sides. Your wedding is in 3 weeks. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, maybe we should focus on finding a solution. This was classic dad behavior, acknowledge that a problem existed without addressing who was responsible or what consequences should follow. He specialized in treating family conflicts like natural disasters that nobody could have prevented or controlled. The solution would have been for Natalie to respect my decision when I told her no, I said. But since that didn't happen, the solution now is for her to take responsibility for what she did and figure out how to make it right. And how exactly do you expect her to do that? My mother asked, her voice taking on an edge of irritation. The dress is damaged. Natalie doesn't have $4,000 to replace it. What do you want her to do, go back in time and undo what happened? The question was designed to make any expectation of accountability seem unreasonable. By focusing on Natalie's inability to fully compensate for the damage, my mother was implying that pursuing any consequences was pointless and vindictive. I want her to admit what she actually did instead of claiming it was an accident, I said. I want her to apologize for going behind my back after I told her no. And I want her to take some responsibility for finding a replacement dress instead of leaving me to deal with this crisis 3 weeks before my wedding. You're being completely unrealistic, my mother said sharply. Natalie is a single mother with no income living in our house. She can't magic up thousands of dollars for a replacement dress. And frankly, I think you're being selfish to expect her to bankrupt herself over a mistake. The word mistake was particularly insulting given the evidence of deliberate destruction. But pointing this out again would only result in another round of excuses and deflection. I decided to try a different approach. Did you see Lily's costume at the party yesterday? I asked. My parents exchanged a glance that confirmed they had indeed seen how my dress materials had been used. After a moment, my mother nodded reluctantly. It was very elaborate, she admitted. Natalie worked really hard to make something special for Lily. Can you describe it for me? I pressed. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. It had a lot of detail work. Lace, beading, that sort of thing. The admission hung in the air between us. They had both seen the costume that was clearly made from my wedding dress materials, yet they were still supporting the story that this had been an accident. So you saw a costume made from French lace and pearl beading, knowing that my dress was made from French lace and pearl beading, and you still believe this was an accidental unraveling? I asked. The important thing is that Lily had a beautiful costume for her party, my mother said firmly. And the damage to your dress is done. Nothing we do now will change that. This response perfectly encapsulated my family's approach to conflict resolution. The perpetrator's goals had been achieved, the damage was irreversible, so the victim should simply accept the situation and move on without making a fuss. I'm going to call Madame Celeste tomorrow to see if there's any possibility of repairing the dress or creating a replacement in time, I said. If that's not possible, I'll need to find another dress with 3 weeks' notice. That sounds like a reasonable plan, my father said, clearly relieved to have the conversation moving toward practical solutions rather than accountability. And I expect Natalie to contribute to whatever costs are involved in fixing this situation, I added. The silence that followed this statement was heavy with disapproval. My mother's expression hardened, and my father returned his attention to his newspaper. I think you're being vindictive, my mother said finally. Punishing Natalie financially when she's already struggling isn't going to fix your dress. It's just going to create more problems for this family. She created the problem, I pointed out. I'm not punishing her by expecting her to help solve it. You know she doesn't have money for this, my mother said. You're asking for something she can't provide, which makes it cruel rather than fair. The conversation was going in circles, with my parents consistently reframing accountability as cruelty and consequences as unreasonable expectations. I realized that no amount of evidence or logical argument was going to change their perspective. I'm going home, I said, standing up and gathering my purse. When Natalie comes back from Carmen's house, tell her I expect to hear from her directly. Not through you, not through excuses, but directly from her. Don't do anything rash, my father called after me as I headed toward the door. Think about what's best for the family. As I drove back to Riverside, I reflected on how, what's best for the family, had always meant what was most convenient for my parents and least disruptive for Natalie. My needs and feelings had never factored into that calculation. When I got home, Daniel took one look at my face and wrapped me in a hug before I could say anything. I showed him the photos and recounted the conversation with my parents. They're not going to hold her accountable, he said after I finished explaining. They're going to keep making excuses until you give up and let it go. I know, I said. But I can't just let this go. This isn't about the money or even the dress anymore. This is about whether I'm willing to accept being treated this way by my own family. Daniel nodded, understanding the larger implications. What do you want to do? First, I'm calling Madame Celeste in the morning to see what options we have. Then I'm going to document everything and decide how to handle Natalie when she finally surfaces. And if your family keeps defending her? I looked at the photos on my phone one more time, seeing the systematic destruction of something that had been created specifically for me with love and artistry. Then I guess I'll find out what my family relationships are really worth, I said. Monday morning, I called Madame Celeste's boutique as soon as they opened. My hands were shaking as I dialed, knowing that this conversation would determine whether my wedding would proceed as planned or become a frantic scramble for alternatives. Madame Celeste herself answered the phone, her elegant French accent immediately recognizable. When I explained what had happened to my dress, the silence on the other end lasted so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Mademoiselle Cassandra," she finally said, her voice heavy with disbelief, "are you telling me that someone deliberately cut apart the gown we created together?" "Yes," I said, and sent her the photos I had taken. "I found it this way yesterday evening. My sister claims it was an accident, but as you can see from the pictures, the cuts are deliberate and systematic." Another long silence followed as she presumably reviewed the images. When she spoke again, her professional composure had given way to genuine outrage. "This is not an accident," she said firmly. "This is vandalism of the worst kind. Someone spent considerable time destroying this dress with fabric shears. Look at how cleanly the lace has been cut, how precisely the beadwork has been removed. This required skill and patience." Her professional assessment confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it from an expert felt validating after my parents' attempts to dismiss the evidence. "Is there any possibility of repairing it?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I am afraid not, Sherry," she said sadly. "The construction of this gown was very specific to your measurements and the pattern of the lace. Even if I had identical materials, which I do not, the time required to recreate it would be several months." "Your wedding is in 3 weeks, non?" "Yes," I said, feeling my hopes deflate completely. "However," she continued, her voice brightening slightly, "I do have one possibility. I recently completed a gown for another bride who unfortunately had to cancel her wedding due to family circumstances. It is a different style than yours, but it is approximately your size and could potentially be altered in time. Would you like to see it?" We scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief that there might be a solution and renewed anger that I was in this situation at all because of Natalie's selfishness. Before heading to work, I decided to gather more information about exactly what had happened over the weekend. I called my cousin Trevor, who lived in Willowbrook and had attended Lily's party with his family. Trevor had always been neutral in family conflicts, making him a reliable source of information. "Cassie, I was wondering when you'd call," he said when he answered. "That party was something else." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Well, Lily's costume was incredible," he said carefully. "I mean, it was gorgeous, but it seemed way too elaborate for a 6-year-old's birthday party. The other kids were wearing regular princess dresses from Target, and Lily looked like she was heading to the Met Gala." He described a costume that was clearly made from my wedding dress materials. Intricate French lace formed the bodice, pearl beading created elaborate patterns across the skirt, and the overall construction was far beyond anything available in children's stores. "The thing is," Trevor continued, "when people complimented Natalie on the costume, she kept talking about how she had sourced the materials from a high-end bridal supplier. She made it sound like she had special connections in the fashion industry. This detail was particularly infuriating. Not only had Natalie destroyed my dress, but she was actively taking credit for the quality and craftsmanship of the materials she had stolen." "Did she mention anything about where she actually got the materials?" I asked. "Not specifically, but she kept posting about it on social media all weekend. You should check her Instagram. She documented the whole process of making the costume." After I hung up with Trevor, I immediately went to Natalie's Instagram account. What I found there made my stomach turn. She had posted a series of stories over the weekend showing the costume creation process, complete with time-lapse videos of her cutting and sewing. The most damning evidence was a video she had posted Saturday morning, before the party. It clearly showed her cutting pieces of French lace with fabric shears, with the caption, "When you have access to the good stuff. #DIY princess #crafting magic #only the best for my baby." Another post showed her carefully removing individual pearls from beaded sections, with the caption, "Hand beading takes forever but so worth it. #attention to detail #princess worthy #crafting life." She had documented her own crime and posted it for the world to see, apparently confident that I would never find out or that my family would protect her if I did. The final post in the series showed Lily wearing the completed costume at the party, with a lengthy caption about how Natalie had worked all night to create something magical for her daughter. The post had dozens of comments praising Natalie's creativity and skill, with several people asking where she had learned such advanced sewing techniques. I screenshot every single post and video before they could be deleted. The evidence was irrefutable. Natalie had not only deliberately destroyed my dress but had bragged about it online and taken credit for the expensive materials and craftsmanship. My phone rang while I was saving the screenshots. It was my Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister, calling from Portland. "Cassandra, honey, I just saw the most disturbing thing on Facebook," she said without preamble. "Is it true that Natalie destroyed your wedding dress?" I was surprised that word had spread so quickly, but then remembered that several relatives had been at the party and had likely seen the costume firsthand. "Yes, it's true," I said. "She cut it apart to make a costume for Lily's birthday party." "Oh my God," Helen said. "I couldn't believe it when my friend Martha sent me the photos from the party. She recognized the lace pattern because she had admired your dress at my Christmas party last year when you brought fabric samples to show us." Martha was Helen's neighbor who worked as a seamstress and had extensive knowledge of luxury fabrics. Her recognition of the specific lace pattern provided additional expert verification of what had happened. Martha said the lace in that costume was definitely French Alassa, probably worth hundreds of dollars per yard, Helen continued. She couldn't understand how Natalie could afford materials like that for a children's costume. "She couldn't," I said grimly. "She stole them from my wedding dress." Helen was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Have you talked to your mother about this?" I recounted my conversation with my parents the previous evening, including their attempts to characterize the destruction as an accident and their refusal to hold Natalie accountable. "That's absolute nonsense," Helen said angrily. "I've seen Martha work with delicate fabrics for 30 years, and she said the cuts in those costume pieces were precise and deliberate. No way that was an accident." "My parents don't want to hear that," I said. "They're more concerned about protecting Natalie's feelings than addressing what she actually did." "Well, I'm not surprised," Helen said with a sigh. "Your mother has been making excuses for Natalie's behavior since she was a toddler. But this crosses a line that can't be uncrossed." Helen promised to talk to other family members who had attended the party to gather more information. She also offered to speak to my mother directly, though we both knew that was unlikely to change anything. My next call was to Daniel's sister Amy, who worked as a nurse but had previously studied fashion design. I sent her the photos of my destroyed dress and asked for her professional opinion. "This is absolutely sickening," she said after reviewing the images. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Look at how they removed the beadwork. They took time to cut each thread individually rather than just ripping it off. And these fabric cuts are clean and measured." Amy's analysis confirmed what Madame Celeste had already told me, but having multiple expert opinions would be important if this situation escalated further. "The most telling thing," Amy continued, "is that they clearly prioritized preserving the usability of the materials over preserving the dress. If this had been an accident or emotional destruction, you'd see jagged tears and damaged pieces. Instead, someone carefully salvaged every usable bit of lace and beading." That afternoon, I went to see the replacement dress that Madame Celeste had suggested. It was beautiful in its own way, a simpler design in ivory silk with subtle embroidery, but it wasn't the dress I had dreamed of wearing. The style was completely different, and while it could be altered to fit me, it would never have the personal significance of the gown we had created together. "I am so sorry this happened to you," Madame Celeste said as she pinned the alterations. "In 30 years of creating wedding gowns, I have never seen such deliberate destruction of someone's dress. I decided to take the replacement dress, knowing that time was running out and I needed to secure something appropriate for the wedding. The alterations would cost an additional $800, and the dress itself was $2,200, not as expensive as my original gown, but still a significant unexpected expense. When I got home that evening, I found 3 missed calls from my mother and a series of increasingly frantic text messages. Apparently, word about the Instagram posts had reached other family members, and people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about what had really happened to my dress. The final text message read, "We need to talk. This has gotten out of hand and you're embarrassing the family with these accusations." I called Daniel and filled him in on everything I had discovered. He listened quietly as I recounted the social media evidence, the expert opinions, and my family's escalating attempts to control the narrative. So now you're embarrassing them? He asked. Not Natalie, who documented herself destroying your dress and posted it online. Apparently, my reaction is the real problem, I said. Not what caused the reaction in the first place. Are you going to call your mother back? I looked at my phone, where another text message had just appeared. Natalie is very upset about these rumors. You need to stop spreading lies about your sister. Yes, I said. I think it's time to have a very direct conversation about what actually happened and what I expect them to do about it. The investigation phase had provided me with irrefutable evidence of Natalie's deliberate actions and my family's willingness to ignore obvious facts to protect her. Now it was time to escalate the consequences and see if anything could force them to acknowledge the truth. I returned my mother's call Tuesday evening, steeling myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. When she answered, her voice was tight with barely controlled frustration. Cassandra, this situation has gotten completely out of hand, she said without any greeting. Half the family is calling me asking questions about your dress, and Natalie is beside herself with worry about these accusations you're spreading. I'm not spreading accusations, I said calmly. I'm telling people what actually happened when they ask. Natalie documented the whole thing on Instagram herself. Those posts were taken out of context, my mother snapped. Natalie was just excited about the costume she made for Lily. She never said anything about using your dress materials. She didn't have to say it explicitly. The evidence speaks for itself, I replied. Multiple people have confirmed that the lace and beading in that costume came from my wedding dress. There was a long pause before my mother's voice softened into a more conciliatory tone. Look, honey, I think we all need to take a step back and focus on what's really important here. Your wedding is in 2.5 weeks, and this family drama is taking away from what should be a happy time. This shift in approach caught me off guard. Throughout our childhood, my mother had two modes when dealing with conflict: aggressive defense of Natalie or strategic retreat when the evidence became overwhelming. It seemed she was moving into retreat mode. I've been thinking about this situation all day, she continued, and I realized that maybe we haven't been as supportive as we should have been. This must be very stressful for you, having to find a new dress so close to your wedding. The acknowledgement felt strange coming from someone who had spent the previous day dismissing my concerns as materialism and drama. I remained cautious, sensing this might be a manipulation tactic rather than genuine recognition of the problem. It has been stressful, I agreed carefully. But it would be a lot less stressful if Natalie would admit what she actually did and take some responsibility for fixing it. Well, that's what I want to talk to you about, my mother said. I spoke with Natalie this morning, and she's willing to meet with you to discuss this situation. She wants to clear the air and find a way to make things right between you two. I was immediately suspicious. Natalie's pattern was to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible, especially when she was clearly in the wrong. The fact that she was suddenly willing to meet suggested either my mother had pressured her or they had devised some strategy to manage the situation. What exactly does she want to discuss? I asked. She wants to explain her side of what happened and hopefully reach some kind of understanding, my mother said. I think you'll find that the situation isn't as black and white as you believe it to be. The phrase, her side of what happened, was telling. It suggested that even now, they were treating this like a misunderstanding between two equal parties rather than acknowledging that one person had destroyed another person's property. When does she want to meet? I asked. How about this weekend? We could all have dinner together at the house, like we used to do. Natalie and Lily will be staying here again, so it would be a good opportunity for everyone to talk things through. The idea of a family dinner to resolve this crisis felt surreal, but I was curious to see what Natalie's explanation would be. I also wanted to observe whether she would admit what she had done when confronted directly with the evidence I had gathered. Fine, I said. But I want Daniel there with me. Of course, my mother said quickly. This affects both of you, so he should definitely be part of the conversation. We agreed to meet for dinner on Saturday evening. After I hung up, I called Daniel to fill him in on the plan. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked. It sounds like they're setting up some kind of intervention where they all gang up on you to accept their version of events. Maybe, I said. But I want to see if Natalie will actually admit what she did when she's forced to discuss it face to face. And I want them to see that I'm not going to back down just because they're uncomfortable with the consequences. The rest of the week passed quietly. I focused on finalizing other wedding details and trying not to think about the upcoming confrontation. Madame Celeste called to confirm that the alterations on my replacement dress were proceeding on schedule, and I managed to find shoes and accessories that would work with the new gown. Saturday arrived with unseasonably cool weather for late September. Daniel and I drove to Willowbrook together, both of us feeling tense about what lay ahead. As we pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed Natalie's car was there, along with a vehicle I didn't recognize. Looks like they might have brought reinforcements, Daniel observed. We were greeted at the door by my father, who seemed more engaged than usual. He shook Daniel's hand warmly and made small talk about the weather and the drive from Riverside. This unusual level of social effort suggested he had been coached to help create a positive atmosphere. In the living room, we found Natalie sitting on the couch with Lily playing quietly nearby. Natalie looked nervous but not particularly guilty or remorseful. Her friend Carmen was also there, presumably for moral support. "Hi Cassie," Natalie said, standing up to give me a hesitant hug. "Thanks for coming. I know this has been a difficult time for everyone." The phrasing was careful and non-committal, acknowledging difficulty without accepting responsibility for causing it. I returned the hug briefly but remained guarded. My mother bustled around serving drinks and appetizers, clearly working hard to maintain a festive atmosphere. She had prepared all my favorite foods from childhood, which felt like both a gesture of love and an attempt at emotional manipulation. "So," my father said once everyone was settled with drinks, "I think we all want to find a way to move past this unfortunate situation and focus on the upcoming wedding." The word "unfortunate" struck me as a particularly inadequate description of deliberate destruction, but I decided to let Natalie speak first before challenging their framing. "I want to start by saying how sorry I am about your dress," Natalie said, looking directly at me. "I know how much it meant to you, and I feel terrible about what happened." This was the closest to an apology I had heard from her, though it was still carefully worded to avoid admitting deliberate wrongdoing. "What exactly are you sorry for?" I asked. Natalie glanced at my mother before answering. "I'm sorry for taking materials from your dress without asking permission. I was desperate to make something special for Lily's party, and I made a bad decision in the heat of the moment." The admission was partial but significant. She had acknowledged taking materials from my dress, which contradicted the previous claims about accidents and unraveling. However, she was still characterizing it as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than the calculated destruction the evidence clearly showed. "So you're admitting that you deliberately cut up my dress?" I pressed. "I took some pieces that I thought you wouldn't miss," she said carefully. "I never intended to ruin the whole dress. I thought I could just borrow small sections and you'd never notice." This version of events was closer to the truth than anything she had previously admitted, but it still minimized the scope of the destruction and suggested it had been more limited than it actually was. "Natalie," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the photos, "look at these pictures. This isn't small sections that I wouldn't miss. You cut away the entire bottom third of the skirt, removed one complete sleeve, and stripped off all the beadwork. How could you possibly think I wouldn't notice this?" Natalie looked at the photos with what appeared to be genuine shock, as if she was seeing the full extent of the damage for the first time. For a moment, I wondered if she had been so focused on the costume creation that she hadn't fully processed what she was doing to my dress. I was working on it over several days," she said slowly. "I guess I didn't realize how much I had taken until it was all done." Carmen spoke up for the first time. "She was really stressed about the party," she said. "Lily had her heart set on this elaborate princess costume, and Natalie didn't have money for the kind of dress Lily wanted. She was up all night working on it." The explanation from Carmen felt rehearsed, as if they had discussed how to present this situation beforehand. It also reinforced the narrative that Natalie's actions were motivated by understandable parental devotion rather than selfishness or malice. "I understand wanting to make something special for Lily," I said. "But I specifically told you that you couldn't use any part of my dress. You agreed to find another solution, and then you went behind my back and did it anyway. I know, Natalie said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I was wrong to do that. I was just so overwhelmed and I wasn't thinking clearly. My mother leaned forward from her chair. The important thing is that Natalie recognizes she made a mistake and wants to make it right, she said. We've all been discussing how to move forward constructively. What did you have in mind? Daniel asked, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. Well, my father said, we know that replacing the dress isn't financially realistic for Natalie right now. But we've talked about some other ways she could contribute to making this situation right. Natalie nodded eagerly. I want to help with your wedding in whatever way I can, she said. I could do decorations, or help with setup, or whatever you need. I just want to show you that I'm really sorry and that I want to support your special day. The offer felt inadequate given the magnitude of what had happened, but there was something appealing about the possibility of moving past this conflict without ongoing family warfare. I was exhausted from the stress of the past week and tempted by the prospect of focusing on positive wedding preparations instead of continuing to fight. That's very generous, Daniel said diplomatically, though I could tell from his tone that he wasn't particularly impressed by the offer. We were also thinking, my mother added, that maybe this could be an opportunity for you girls to rebuild your relationship. You've grown apart over the years, and maybe working together on wedding preparations could help you reconnect. The suggestion that this crisis could somehow become a bonding experience was typical of my mother's approach to family problems. She consistently looked for ways to reframe conflicts as opportunities for growth rather than addressing the underlying issues that caused them. Lily had been playing quietly throughout this conversation, but she suddenly looked up at me with bright eyes. Aunt Cassie, did you like my princess dress? Mommy worked really hard to make it pretty. The innocent question from my 6-year-old niece hit me harder than any of the adult explanations. Lily had no idea that her beautiful costume had been created by destroying something precious to me. In her world, her mother had simply worked hard to make her happy. It was very beautiful, sweetheart, I said honestly. Your mommy is very talented at sewing. Natalie's face brightened at this acknowledgement, and I could see her interpreting it as forgiveness or acceptance of what had happened. So what do you think? My mother asked. Can we put this behind us and focus on making your wedding day special? I looked around the room at my family, all of whom were watching me expectantly. They had successfully reframed the conversation from accountability for wrongdoing to my willingness to accept their peace offering and move forward. The pressure to say yes was enormous, and part of me desperately wanted to believe that this could actually work. I need to think about it, I said finally. This has been a lot to process, and I want to discuss it with Daniel before making any decisions. Of course, my father said. Take all the time you need. We just want you to know that we're all committed to making this right. As we drove home to Riverside, Daniel and I discussed the evening's revelations. Natalie had admitted to deliberately taking materials from my dress, which was more than I had expected. Her offer to help with wedding preparations showed some recognition that she needed to make amends. Most importantly, the family gathering had been relatively civil, without the usual defensive arguments and personal attacks. What are you thinking? Daniel asked as we pulled into our apartment complex. I'm thinking that maybe I should take the win, I said. She admitted what she did, she apologized, and they're offering to help make up for it. Maybe continuing to fight isn't worth the stress. And you think this resolves everything? I considered his question carefully. No, it doesn't resolve everything. But maybe it resolves enough that we can move forward without this hanging over our wedding. That night, I lay awake thinking about whether accepting Natalie's apology and help would be the mature, forgiving response or simply enabling behavior that would inevitably be repeated in the future. The prospect of family peace was appealing, but something about the evening still felt incomplete and unsatisfying. By Sunday morning, I had convinced myself that giving Natalie a chance to make amends was the right thing to do. I called my mother and told her I was willing to accept the proposed arrangement. "Oh honey, that's wonderful," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I think you're making the right choice. Family is so important, and holding grudges only hurts everyone." We agreed that Natalie would come to Riverside the following weekend to help with wedding preparation tasks, and I began to feel cautiously optimistic that we might actually be able to put this crisis behind us. Little did I know that the most shocking revelation was still to come. The following weekend, Natalie came to Riverside as planned to help with wedding preparations. I had spent the week convincing myself that accepting her help was the mature thing to do and that maybe this crisis could actually strengthen our relationship. Daniel remained skeptical but agreed to give her a chance to prove her sincerity. Natalie arrived Saturday morning with Lily in tow, carrying a large bag of craft supplies and wearing what appeared to be a genuinely apologetic expression. She hugged me warmly and immediately began asking about what tasks she could help with. "I brought everything I might need for decorations," she said, unpacking ribbons, flowers, and various crafting tools. "And I've been watching YouTube tutorials all week to learn new techniques. I really want to make this special for you." Her enthusiasm seemed genuine, and I found myself relaxing slightly as we worked together on centerpiece arrangements for the reception tables. Lily played quietly with her coloring books, occasionally showing us her artwork and receiving praise from both of us. "This is actually kind of fun," I admitted to Daniel during a break while Natalie was outside with Lily. "She's really trying, and she does have good creative instincts." "I'm glad it's going well," he said, though I could tell he was still reserving judgment. "Just don't let your guard down completely." Sunday afternoon, we were working on assembling favor boxes when Natalie's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face immediately changed, becoming tense and worried. "I need to take this," she said, stepping into the bathroom for privacy. I could hear her voice through the thin apartment walls, though I couldn't make out specific words. The tone was clearly argumentative, with Natalie's voice rising and falling in what sounded like defensive explanations. When she emerged 15 minutes later, she looked shaken and upset. Her hands were trembling slightly as she sat back down at the craft table. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just some drama with Carmen," she said dismissively. "Nothing important." But her demeanor had completely changed. She was distracted and jumpy, frequently checking her phone and seeming to have trouble focusing on the tasks at hand. When Lily asked her a simple question about whether they could stop for ice cream on the way home, Natalie snapped at her with uncharacteristic harshness. "Can you just give me 5 minutes of peace?" she said sharply. "I'm dealing with important things right now." Lily's face crumpled, and I immediately moved to comfort my niece while giving Natalie a questioning look. Throughout all of Natalie's flaws, she had always been patient and loving with her daughter. "Sorry," Natalie said quickly, seeming to realize how she had sounded. "Mommy's just a little stressed right now, baby. We'll definitely get ice cream." They left earlier than planned, with Natalie claiming that Lily was getting tired and cranky. As they packed up their things, Natalie seemed eager to escape, avoiding extended conversation and declining my offer to have them stay for dinner. "Thank you for letting me help," she said as they headed toward the door. "I hope the decorations turn out beautifully for your big day." After they left, Daniel and I finished the favor boxes on our own. The atmosphere felt strange and unsettled after Natalie's sudden mood change, but I tried to focus on the positive aspects of the weekend. "She really did help a lot," I said as we cleaned up the craft supplies. "And the decorations look great. Maybe this is actually going to work out." Monday evening, I was at work late finishing up a project when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Carmen's name, which surprised me since we rarely spoke directly. "Cassandra, I need to talk to you about something important," she said without preamble. Her voice sounded strained and upset. "Okay," I said, immediately on alert. "What's going on?" "It's about Natalie and what really happened with your dress," she said. "I can't keep this secret anymore, especially after seeing how hard you're trying to forgive her and move forward." My heart began racing. "What do you mean?" "The story she told you about taking materials in the heat of the moment?" "That's not what actually happened," Carmen said. "She planned the whole thing weeks in advance." I sat down heavily in my office chair, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. "What are you talking about?" "She came to me about a month before Lily's party, furious about your engagement and wedding plans," Carmen explained. "She kept saying it wasn't fair that you got to have this perfect wedding while her life was falling apart." She was obsessed with your dress specifically. The words hit me like physical blows. Everything we had discussed over the weekend, all the progress I thought we had made, had been built on another layer of lies. She told me she had seen your dress hanging in your parents' closet and that it made her sick to look at it, Carmen continued. She said you didn't deserve something so beautiful when you already had everything else going for you. Did she tell you she was planning to destroy it? I asked, dreading the answer. Not exactly, Carmen said. But she kept talking about how she was going to make sure Lily had the most amazing princess costume ever, no matter what it took. And she made comments about how some people needed to learn that they couldn't have everything they wanted. I felt physically ill as I processed this information. The weekend of helping with wedding preparations, the apparent remorse, the family dinner where she had apologized, all of it had been performed while she knew the full truth about her premeditated actions. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because she called me yesterday in a panic, Carmen said. She was terrified that I was going to tell you the truth about what she had said before the party. She spent 20 minutes trying to convince me to stick to the story about it being a spur-of-the-moment decision. This explained Natalie's strange behavior after the phone call on Sunday. She had been worried that her conspiracy was unraveling and that I was about to discover the extent of her planning and deception. There's more, Carmen said reluctantly. She also told me that she had been planning this for weeks as payback for what she called years of you getting everything while she got nothing. She said you needed to experience disappointment for once in your life. The malice behind these words was breathtaking. This wasn't about making Lily's party special or even about financial desperation. This was deliberate cruelty designed to hurt me during one of the most important times in my life. She bragged about how she had studied your dress carefully over several visits to figure out the best way to salvage the materials, Carmen continued. She even researched the value of the lace and beading online so she would know exactly what she was taking. The level of premeditation was staggering. Natalie hadn't just destroyed my dress in a moment of poor judgment, she had conducted reconnaissance, planned her approach, and calculated the financial impact of her actions. I should have told you sooner, Carmen said. But Natalie convinced me that telling you would just cause more family drama and wouldn't change anything since the dress was already ruined. I realize now that was wrong. What made you decide to tell me now? I asked. Seeing you this weekend, trying so hard to rebuild your relationship with her, Carmen said. And knowing that she was sitting there accepting your forgiveness while planning to never tell you the truth. It made me sick to watch. After I hung up with Carmen, I sat in my empty office feeling completely numb. Everything I thought I knew about the situation had been wrong. Natalie's apparent remorse had been calculated performance. Her willingness to help with wedding preparations had been motivated by guilt about her lies, not genuine desire to make amends. Most importantly, her actions hadn't been the result of stress or poor judgment. They had been planned, deliberate revenge for perceived injustices that existed only in her imagination. I called Daniel and asked him to meet me at the office. When he arrived, I recounted everything Carmen had told me. He listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each new revelation. So the family dinner, the apology, the weekend helping with decorations, all of that was performed while she knew she had deliberately planned to destroy your dress, he said when I finished. Exactly, I said. She sat there accepting my forgiveness for something she claimed was a mistake while knowing it was actually premeditated revenge. What are you going to do? I thought about this question carefully. The weekend had given me hope that we could move past this crisis and rebuild some kind of relationship. Now I knew that hope had been based on fundamental lies about Natalie's motivations and level of remorse. I'm going to confront her with this information, I said. And I'm going to tell my parents exactly what kind of person they've been protecting. Are you sure you want to do that? You know they're just going to make more excuses. Maybe, I said. But they deserve to know who they're really defending. And I deserve to stop pretending that this can be fixed with craft projects and family dinners. Tuesday morning, I called Natalie directly. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright and cheerful. Cassie. I had such a great time this weekend. I can't wait to see how beautiful everything looks at your wedding. The false warmth in her voice, knowing what I now knew about her true feelings and motivations, was almost unbearable. "I talked to Carmen yesterday," I said without preamble. The silence that followed was long and heavy. When Natalie finally spoke, her voice had lost all its artificial cheer. "What did she tell you?" she asked quietly. "Everything," I said. "About how you planned this weeks in advance. About how you said I needed to experience disappointment. About how you researched the value of my dress materials before you destroyed it." Another long silence. I could hear Natalie breathing on the other end of the line, presumably trying to figure out how to respond to being caught in such an elaborate lie. "Carmen doesn't know what she's talking about," Natalie said finally. "She's jealous of our relationship and she's trying to cause problems between us." The immediate deflection to attacking Carmen's credibility was predictable but still infuriating. Even when caught with irrefutable evidence, Natalie's instinct was to lie and manipulate rather than accept responsibility. "So you're saying Carmen made up detailed conversations about your planning and motivations?" I asked. "I'm saying she's exaggerating things I said when I was upset," Natalie said. "You know how people can twist words to make them sound worse than they were meant. What about your comment that I needed to experience disappointment for once in my life?" "I never said that," Natalie said firmly. "Carmen is lying if she told you I said that." The willingness to continue lying even when confronted with specific quotes was remarkable. Natalie was prepared to maintain her deception indefinitely rather than admit the truth about her actions and motivations. "I think we're done here," I said. "Don't contact me again unless you're ready to tell the truth about what you actually did and why you did it." "Cassie, wait," she said desperately. "Don't let Carmen destroy what we've built this weekend." We were finally getting close again. "We weren't getting close," I said. "You were performing remorse while planning to never tell me the truth. That's not a relationship, that's manipulation." I hung up before she could respond and immediately called my parents to request another family meeting. It was time to present them with the full truth about their golden child and see if anything could penetrate their willful blindness. Wednesday evening, I sat across from my parents and Natalie at the same kitchen table where we had held our previous family meeting. This time, however, the atmosphere was completely different. My parents looked uncomfortable and defensive, while Natalie appeared genuinely frightened for the first time since this whole ordeal began. I had spent the previous day preparing for this confrontation by organizing all the evidence I had gathered. Carmen had agreed to join us by phone to corroborate her account of Natalie's pre-planning. I also had screenshots of expert opinions from Madame Celeste, Martha the seamstress, and Daniel's sister Amy, all confirming that the dress destruction had been deliberate and calculated. I asked for this meeting because new information has come to light about what really happened to my wedding dress, I began, placing my folder of evidence on the table. Information that completely contradicts everything Natalie told us during our last conversation. My mother immediately bristled. "Cassandra, we already resolved this situation. Natalie apologized, she helped with your wedding preparations, and everyone agreed to move forward. Why are you reopening old wounds?" "Because the apology was based on lies," I said firmly. "Natalie didn't destroy my dress in a moment of poor judgment or desperation. She planned it weeks in advance as deliberate revenge against me." Natalie's face went white, but she quickly composed herself. "That's absolutely not true," she said. "I don't know who's been filling your head with these ideas, but they're completely false." "Carmen is going to tell you herself," I said, pulling out my phone. "She's the one who told me about your real motivations and planning." I called Carmen and put the phone on speaker. Her voice was shaky but determined as she recounted the conversations she had had with Natalie in the weeks leading up to Lily's party. She told me she was furious about Cassandra's wedding and that she was tired of watching her sister get everything while she got nothing, Carmen said. She specifically mentioned the dress multiple times, saying it made her sick to see something so expensive hanging there when her own life was falling apart. "That's not what I said," Natalie interrupted. "Carmen, you're twisting my words. I was just venting about feeling left out of wedding planning, not plotting anything. You told me that Cassandra needed to learn that she couldn't have everything she wanted," Carmen continued, ignoring Natalie's protests. "You said she needed to experience disappointment for once in her privileged life. My father looked genuinely shocked by this revelation. Throughout our childhood, he had remained largely passive during family conflicts, but the level of malice Carmen was describing seemed to penetrate his usual detachment. You researched the value of the lace and beading online, Carmen added. You showed me articles about French Alassa lace and how much it cost per yard. You were proud of how much money you were essentially stealing. This is ridiculous, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. Carmen obviously has some kind of grudge against Natalie. Why should we believe anything she says? Because everything she's saying is consistent with the evidence, I said, opening my folder. Look at Natalie's Instagram posts again. She didn't just document the costume creation, she bragged about having access to high-end materials. She posted time-lapse videos of herself cutting the lace with fabric shears. This wasn't spontaneous, she planned each step. I showed them the screenshots I had saved, pointing out specific captions and timestamps that supported Carmen's account of premeditation. And here's Madame Celeste's professional assessment, I continued, reading from her written statement. Quote, the destruction of this gown required extensive planning and skill. Someone spent considerable time studying the construction to determine how to remove valuable materials while causing maximum damage to the overall garment. Natalie was breathing heavily, her composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence. You're all ganging up on me, she said, tears beginning to flow. I made a mistake, and I apologized. Why can't that be enough? Because it wasn't a mistake, I said. And your apology was based on a lie about your motivations. You sat in this kitchen last weekend accepting my forgiveness while knowing you had planned this as revenge against me. That's not true, Natalie said desperately. I was desperate to make Lily's party special, and I made a bad decision. Everything else is just people reading things into innocent comments. My mother leaned forward, still trying to protect Natalie despite the mounting evidence. Even if some of what Carmen is saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that Natalie feels terrible about what happened. She's shown genuine remorse. Has she? I asked. Because when I confronted her yesterday with Carmen's information, her first response was to lie again. She denied saying things that Carmen quoted directly. Even now, she's still not telling the truth about what she did or why she did it. My father spoke for the first time since Carmen's revelations. Natalie, did you plan this in advance? He asked directly. Natalie looked around the table wildly, clearly calculating whether she could maintain her lies in the face of overwhelming evidence. I thought about using some fabric from Cassie's dress, she admitted slowly. But I never planned to ruin the whole thing. This partial admission was progress, but it still minimized her actions and avoided acknowledging the malicious motivations Carmen had described. What about your comment that I needed to experience disappointment? I pressed. I never said that, Natalie insisted. Carmen is exaggerating things I said when I was upset about other things in my life. I ended the call with Carmen and pulled up the expert assessments I had gathered. 3 different fashion professionals have confirmed that your work on my dress was systematic and calculated, I said. You didn't accidentally ruin it while trying to borrow small pieces. You deliberately dismantled it to harvest the maximum amount of valuable materials. The evidence is overwhelming, Daniel said, speaking for the first time. And every time Cassandra presents new facts, Natalie changes her story just enough to account for what can't be denied anymore. My mother's defense mechanisms were activating in response to this criticism of her favorite daughter. I think you're all being very unfair to Natalie, she said. She's admitted that she made poor choices, and she's shown genuine effort to make amends. What more do you want from her? I want the truth, I said. I want her to admit that she planned this as revenge against me. I want her to acknowledge that her apology was based on lies. And I want her to take full responsibility for the malicious nature of her actions. You're asking for her to confess to being a monster, my mother said angrily. She's not perfect, but she's not the villain you're trying to make her out to be. The protection of Natalie at all costs was so ingrained in my mother's worldview that she couldn't acknowledge the evidence even when it was presented systematically and corroborated by multiple sources. Look at this objectively, I said, spreading out all the evidence on the table. We have Carmen's testimony about premeditation. We have social media posts showing calculated execution. We have expert opinions confirming deliberate destruction. We have Natalie's own admissions about researching material values. At what point does the pattern become undeniable? My father studied the documents I had laid out, his expression growing more troubled with each piece of evidence. "This is a lot more serious than I thought it was," he said quietly. "It's serious because it was meant to be serious," I said. "This wasn't a mistake or poor judgment. This was calculated cruelty designed to hurt me during one of the most important times in my life." Natalie suddenly stood up from the table, her face flushed with anger. "Fine," she said loudly. "You want to know the truth?" "Yes, I planned it. Yes, I was angry about your perfect wedding while my life was falling apart. Yes, I wanted you to experience some disappointment for once." The room fell completely silent. After weeks of lies, excuses, and partial admissions, Natalie had finally confessed to the deliberate, malicious nature of her actions. "I was tired of watching you get everything handed to you while I struggled," she continued, her voice rising. "Your perfect job, your perfect fiancé, your perfect wedding dress. Meanwhile, I'm a single mother living with our parents and can't even afford a decent costume for my daughter's birthday party." My mother looked stricken, finally hearing directly from Natalie the vindictive motivations that had driven her actions. "So yes, I took your precious dress apart, and I'm glad I did it," Natalie said defiantly. "For once in your life, you had to deal with something not going your way. For once, you had to experience what the rest of us go through all the time." The confession was everything I had wanted to hear in terms of honesty, but the complete lack of remorse was more disturbing than I had expected. Natalie wasn't apologizing for her actions, she was justifying them based on her perception that I had somehow had life too easy. "Do you hear yourself?" Daniel asked incredulously. "You deliberately destroyed something irreplaceable that your sister saved for and treasured, and you're proud of it?" "I'm proud that I finally stood up for myself instead of just watching her get everything while I got nothing," Natalie said. My father's face was pale with shock. "Natalie, how can you say something like that? How can you be proud of hurting your sister deliberately?" "Because she's never had to struggle for anything," Natalie shot back. "Everything just falls into her lap while the rest of us have to fight for scraps." The conversation had revealed not just what Natalie had done, but the deep-seated resentment and entitlement that had motivated her actions. She genuinely believed that my success and happiness were somehow stolen from her, and that destroying my wedding dress was justified revenge for perceived injustices. "I think we need to take a break," my mother said, clearly overwhelmed by what she had just heard. "Everyone is saying things they might regret." "I don't regret anything I've said," Natalie declared. "I'm tired of pretending to be sorry for finally standing up to the family golden child." She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving the rest of us sitting in stunned silence. A few moments later, we heard the front door slam and her car starting in the driveway. My mother sat with her head in her hands, finally forced to confront the reality of who her favorite daughter actually was. My father stared at the evidence still spread across the table, processing the magnitude of what Natalie had admitted. "I had no idea she felt that way," my mother said quietly. "I had no idea she could be so cruel." "The signs were always there," I said gently. "You just chose not to see them because acknowledging them would have been too painful." "What do we do now?" my father asked. I gathered up my evidence and put it back in the folder. "Now you know the truth about what happened and why it happened," I said. "What you do with that information is up to you." As Daniel and I drove home to Riverside, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. I had finally gotten the truth and the confession I had wanted, but the cost had been the complete destruction of any possibility of a genuine relationship with my sister. "How do you feel about what just happened?" Daniel asked. "Relieved that the truth is finally out," I said. "And heartbroken that my sister is capable of that level of deliberate cruelty." The revelation had answered all my questions about what had happened, but it had also raised new questions about how to move forward with family relationships that had been built on protecting someone who was fundamentally unwilling to take responsibility for her actions or show genuine remorse for the pain she caused others. For 3 days after Natalie's explosive confession, I heard nothing from my family. No calls, no texts, no attempts to smooth things over or minimize what had happened. The silence was both peaceful and unsettling, representing the first time in my adult life that a major family conflict hadn't been immediately followed by pressure to forgive and move on. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week before my wedding, I was finalizing seating charts when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown local number, which I almost didn't answer. "Hello, this is Madame Celeste," came the familiar French accent. "I hope you don't mind that I am calling you directly, but something quite extraordinary has happened." "Of course," I said, immediately concerned. "Is everything all right with my replacement dress?" "The dress is perfect and ready for your final fitting," she assured me. "But that is not why I am calling. I have just had the most unusual morning, and I felt you should know about it immediately." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "About an hour ago, a young woman came to my boutique with a little girl. She introduced herself as Natalie, your sister. She said she wanted to commission me to recreate your original wedding dress as a surprise." My stomach dropped. After everything that had happened, Natalie was still trying to manipulate the situation rather than accepting the consequences of her actions. "She brought photographs of a child's costume," Madame Celeste continued, "and asked if I could use those images to reconstruct what your dress had looked like before it was damaged. She seemed quite desperate and kept insisting that money was no object." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that recreating the dress would be impossible in 1 week, and that such a project would cost significantly more than the original gown due to the rush timeline," Madame Celeste said. But then she said something very strange. I waited, dreading what was coming next. "She told me that she had made a terrible mistake and destroyed your dress, but that she had all the materials from it and could bring them to me to work with." When I asked what she meant, she became very flustered and said she would explain everything if I would just agree to help her. The audacity was breathtaking. Natalie was apparently planning to offer Madame Celeste the destroyed pieces of my dress as raw materials to recreate it, as if that would somehow undo what she had done. I became suspicious, Madame Celeste continued, because her story did not make sense. "If she had materials from your dress, how had it been damaged? And why would she have pieces of it?" So I asked her directly what had happened. "What did she say?" "She broke down completely," Madame Celeste said. "She admitted that she had cut up your dress herself to make the costume for her daughter. She said she regretted it deeply and wanted to fix her mistake before your wedding." I closed my eyes, trying to process this new development. Even after her defiant confession to the family, Natalie was still trying to find a way to avoid the full consequences of her actions. I told her that what she described was not a mistake but deliberate destruction of someone else's property, Madame Celeste said firmly. I also told her that bringing me stolen materials to recreate the dress would make me complicit in her crime. How did she respond to that? She became quite upset and said that I didn't understand how desperate she was to make things right with you. She offered to pay me double my usual fee if I would just help her surprise you with a replacement dress. The conversation with Madame Celeste continued for several more minutes, with details that painted a picture of Natalie in complete emotional breakdown, finally grasping the magnitude of what she had done as her wedding date approached. "I thought you should know about this encounter," Madame Celeste concluded, "because it suggests that your sister may be planning some kind of dramatic gesture at your wedding. In my experience, people who make these kinds of desperate offers often have unrealistic expectations about grand gestures solving serious problems." After thanking Madame Celeste and hanging up, I immediately called Daniel to fill him in on this latest development. "She's losing it," he said after I finished recounting the conversation. "The reality of what she did is finally hitting her, but instead of accepting responsibility, she's trying to find a magic solution that will make everything go back to normal." "Should I call her?" I asked. "Should I tell my parents what she's trying to do?" "I think you should let it play out," Daniel said. "She's finally facing real consequences for her actions, and trying to rescue her from them would just enable more of the same behavior." That afternoon, my father called. His voice sounded tired and older than I remembered. "Cassie, I need to tell you what's been happening since Wednesday night," he said. "Your mother and I have been doing a lot of talking, and we've made some decisions about how to handle this situation going forward." "Okay," I said carefully. First, we owe you a huge apology, he said. We've been protecting Natalie from the consequences of her actions for so long that we lost sight of how much damage we were enabling. What she did to your dress, and more importantly, her attitude about it, opened our eyes to problems we should have addressed years ago. This acknowledgement was more than I had ever expected to hear from my father. We've told Natalie that she needs to find somewhere else to live, he continued. We can't continue enabling her behavior, and frankly, we need some distance to figure out our own role in creating this situation. I was stunned. My parents had never set firm boundaries with Natalie, and asking her to move out represented a complete reversal of their usual approach. Where is she going to go? I asked. That's for her to figure out, my father said firmly. She's 26 years old with a child to support. It's time for her to take responsibility for her own life instead of expecting us to bail her out of every problem. And Lily? Lily will always be welcome here, he said. But Natalie needs to prove that she can be a responsible parent and a decent person before we're willing to house and support her again. The conversation continued with my father explaining that they had also decided not to attend my wedding unless I specifically wanted them there. He said they understood if their presence would be a reminder of the family drama and didn't want to cast a shadow over my special day. I want you there, I said without hesitation. You're finally holding her accountable, and I want to celebrate that progress. What about Natalie? He asked. She's still invited, technically, though I can't imagine she would actually come after everything that's happened. I thought about this carefully. Part of me wanted to uninvite her completely, but another part was curious to see whether she would show up and, if so, how she would behave. The invitation stands, I said finally. But if she comes, she needs to understand that this is my day, not an opportunity for her to create more drama or attempt some grand gesture of reconciliation. Sunday evening, exactly 6 days before my wedding, Natalie called me directly. Her voice was hoarse and shaky, suggesting she had been crying extensively. Cassie, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, she began, but I need to tell you something important. I'm listening, I said. I went to your dress designer yesterday to try to commission a replacement dress for you, she said. I know it was probably stupid, but I was desperate to find some way to fix what I had done. I heard about that, I said. She told me that what I did was criminal, Natalie continued, and that offering to use pieces of your dress to recreate it would make her an accessory to theft. Hearing her say that made me realize how serious this really is. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Natalie sounded like she was beginning to grasp the full implications of her actions. I'd been telling myself that it was just a dress, and that you could get another one, and that family should forgive each other no matter what, she said. But it wasn't just a dress, was it? It was something you had saved for and dreamed about, and I destroyed it on purpose because I was jealous and angry. The acknowledgement was more honest than anything she had said previously, but I remained cautious about responding with forgiveness too quickly. I don't expect you to forgive me, she continued. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I want you to know that I finally understand what I really did, and I'm ashamed of the person I've been. What are you going to do now? I asked. I'm moving out of Mom and Dad's house, she said. They asked me to leave, and honestly, I think that's the right thing. I've been using their support as an excuse to avoid growing up and taking responsibility for my own life. Where will you go? I'm going to stay with Carmen temporarily while I look for a job and an apartment, she said. She's been a good friend despite everything, and she's willing to help me get back on my feet if I'm serious about changing. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Natalie outlining plans that sounded more realistic and responsible than anything I had heard from her in years. She had apparently spent the week since her confession doing serious self-reflection about her patterns of behavior and their impact on others. I won't be at your wedding, she said as our conversation neared its end. I know I'm technically still invited, but I think my presence would just be a distraction from what should be a beautiful day for you and Daniel. That's probably for the best, I agreed. I hope someday I can prove to you that I'm capable of being the sister you deserve, she said. But I understand that day is a long way off, and it may never come. After we hung up, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Natalie was finally accepting the full consequences of her actions. Sadness that our relationship had been damaged beyond immediate repair. And cautious hope that perhaps, with time and genuine change, we might eventually find a way forward. My wedding day arrived with perfect October weather and no family drama. My parents attended and were genuinely supportive, focusing entirely on celebrating Daniel and me rather than managing Natalie's needs or emotions. The replacement dress looked beautiful, and while it wasn't the gown I had originally planned to wear, it represented something meaningful in its own way, my ability to adapt and move forward despite others' attempts to sabotage my happiness. 6 months later, Natalie sent me a card with a simple message: "I'm sorry. I'm working on being better. I hope you're happy." She had included a photo of herself at what appeared to be a job interview, dressed professionally and looking more mature than I had seen her in years. I didn't respond to the card immediately, but I kept it. The healing of our relationship, if it ever happened, would require years of consistent change from her, not just apologies and promises. But for the first time since childhood, I had hoped that my sister might actually be capable of becoming someone I could trust and respect. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes short-term pain. It also taught me that true accountability requires not just admission of wrongdoing, but genuine understanding of impact and sustained commitment to change. Most importantly, I learned that my own happiness and well-being didn't depend on maintaining relationships with people who were unwilling to treat me with basic respect and honesty, even if those people were family members I had loved my entire life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.